A new Gallup poll out today finds that while the majority of Americans support drone strikes abroad on suspected terrorists, they don't feel the same way if it's an American citizen. And that's whether it's here or on foreign soil. But as always, things aren't quite that simple. Let's not forget that many supported the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen that the government said had a key operational role in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So how do we make sense of it all? Joining me now to discuss, we have The Guardian's Glenn Greenwald in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Hi, Glenn. Thanks for being here. Let me pull up your piece on this that you wrote in The Guardian today, where you said the racism that fuels the war on terror. And so you were breaking down some of these numbers, but you said that it's not the only thing behind it, but the racism definitely plays a role here. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. I mean, here's what struck me about the poll today, which is polls for the last 2 or 3 years have shown overwhelming support for the use of drones generally. And the reason is obvious. Republicans have long supported this kind of approach, and Democrats, since it's President Obama doing it, now support it as well. But what this poll said was interesting. It asked specifically whether people support the use of drones to kill suspected terrorists who are U.S. citizens on foreign soil. And a majority, 52%, said they would not support, that they oppose the use of drones to target U.S. citizens who are suspected terrorists when they're on foreign soil. And the reason that was so striking is because that's exactly what the Obama administration did when it killed the U.S.-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen using a drone strike. And yet large percentages, when that happened, said that they supported the killing of al-Awlaki. And so there's this discrepancy that I found fascinating, which is if you ask Americans today, do you support the use of drone strikes to kill Americans on foreign soil who are suspected terrorists, a majority say they oppose it. And yet a large majority, when al-Awlaki was killed, said they support it. There's obviously a contradiction. And I wanted to understand what causes that contradiction, that discrepancy. And as you said, there are lots of reasons, but I think one of them is that when you ask Americans, do you agree that the U.S. government should be able to kill fellow Americans on foreign soil, when they say no, they're thinking about sort of the people who live down the street, their neighbors, their family members, people who look like them. They're not thinking about people with Muslim names like Anwar al-Awlaki who wear white robes and are in Yemen, or thinking about his 16-year-old American son, Abdul Rahman, who was also killed by a drone strike in Yemen. There's clearly an aspect of not just Islamophobia, but racism that accounts for that discrepancy, where when people asked in these polls are thinking about Americans, they're thinking about white Americans, Christian Americans, Americans who look like them, and not Muslim Americans, because they've been trained not to think about Muslims as real Americans for so long now.
I mean, there's definitely been, a lot of fear based in some of this politics since 9/11, since this war on terror began. I mean, but a lot of people live in very diverse communities and very diverse cities, too. So, specifically here, if you want to talk about Anwar al-Awlaki or Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, his son, what about perhaps some demonization, within the media? We know that there's definitely was a government campaign to say that he was had an operational role in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, even though they don't actually want to give any evidence of that. There's got to be something else to it that works, because you say that the only way that we should look at this is legally. You either say yes or you say no on a legal basis, but people don't break it down that way.
Right. I mean, I think, and I acknowledge this too, that it's easy to say in the abstract that you oppose the killing of U.S. citizens on foreign soil who are accused of being terrorists. And it's much harder to say you oppose it when there's a specific individual who has been so villainized, so demonized, like Anwar al-Awlaki has. So I think that is clearly a factor, as you suggest. Still, I think that there is a clear sense Americans are inculcated to understand that the mere fact that the government accuses somebody of being something, or that the media publishes leaks from the government containing those accusations, we all instinctively understand that that is not the same as proof of guilt. So if the American government were to simply say, we're going to send in the police to this apartment and shoot this person in the head while he sleeps, because just trust us, we have evidence that he's a rapist or a murderer or a child molester, most Americans would instinctively react to that as though that was incredibly threatening and wrong. Well, you can't just go and kill Americans or whoever you want because you claim that there's evidence that they've done something awful. You need to show that evidence in a court of law. Even if we were convinced the person was guilty, that's how most of us would react. And yet in the case of al-Awlaki, there's very little effort to react that way. There's very little sense of, well, look, if you really have all this evidence, like you claim that he was a terrorist, that he was involved in Al-Qaeda, that he was plotting against Americans, why didn't you go to a court and show that evidence to a court and indict him? Or why don't you show that evidence when the ACLU sues you on behalf of his father to stop you from killing his son? Why have you resisted showing this evidence every step of the way? There's none of that skepticism. And I think a big reason why that's lacking, why people are so willing to say, well, if the government says he's a terrorist, I'm willing to believe it without a trial, is very much because of this sort of nationalistic, religious and racist bias that has been inculcated in the public to sustain this war on terror.